This lecture is the recording of the lecture that was split into two parts and is taking place on September 22nd and 23rd in the AP classes. The lecture is on neurons, the nervous system, and the endocrine system. We're going to start with the nervous system. We can see that the nervous system is actually split into two primary sections, the peripheral and the central nervous system. The peripheral is also split into the autonomic and somatic, which I'll cover in a moment. And then the autonomic is also split into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. The peripheral nervous system is the role that the nervous system plays in the rest of the body. The nervous system is the master system of the body, and when the nervous system is controlling the body, it has to have cells of its system in order to control all our internal organs and our muscles. So this is the brain controlling all our internal organs like our stomach and pancreas and liver, etc., along with all of our muscles, along with reacting to whatever things happen to those organs and also whatever happens to our body outside our body from external stimuli. The somatic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that controls voluntary actions. This is primarily muscle movement. So when the muscles need to move, we make this conscious decision. The brain sends a signal out to those muscles to make it move. The autonomic nervous system is all those parts of the body that we don't really have control over, such as breathing, circulation of blood with heartbeat, the functions of the inner organs, etc. And so digestion. And so there are a lot of things that have to take place within the body to make it function properly. And the autonomic nervous system is what's controlling that. Within the autonomic nervous system, we can also split it up into its sympathetic and parasympathetic states. These refer to a state of arousal or a state of calm. These are only referring to those autonomic systems. So like circulation of blood, respiration of the air, digestion, the filtering of toxins by our liver, production of blood sugar from our pancreas, etc. When we're in a state of arousal, though, our body goes into what we call fight or flight mode, where it tries to keep us alive. During this time, most of our internal organs temporarily shut down as blood sugar is being diverted to our muscles. This makes us faster and stronger so that we can escape danger. If we're in a state of arousal, we're worked up, and usually this is due to a state of anger or a state of fear or a state of agitation. Our heartbeat will accelerate, our breath rate will accelerate, our pupils will dilate, allowing us to see better, we'll be able to hear better, and even things, non-essential muscles like the bladder loses its blood sugar, and then therefore we lose control over it so that we can devote more of our energy to keeping us alive. When we're in a state of calm, however, we are in the parasympathetic state, and the reverse happens. Our heartbeat slows down, digestion speeds up, our breath rate slows down, our pupils contract, our bladder contracts, etc. In the central nervous system, we have the brain and the spinal cord. Although there's a lot to discuss with the brain, the thing that the brain can do is create something called a neural network. And this is essentially just a biological explanation of how we learn through experience. When we first start doing a behavior or learning some new knowledge, like let's say another language, our neurons, the cells in our brain, form literal links. Tissue will literally connect these neurons together. And the more we learn something or the more that we practice that behavior, those two neurons will link to four, and then those four neurons will link to four more. And eventually this network of neurons will grow bigger and bigger and bigger, ultimately making us better as we're able to learn from experience when this occurs. Our spinal cord has two purposes. The first is to serve as a conduit between the rest of the body and the brain. So almost all the signals that the rest of the body is sending to the brain have to go through the spinal cord. And then once it goes through the spinal cord, it goes up to the brain. But additionally, the spinal cord also has the ability to keep us alive and keep us from danger. If we're experiencing damage in some way or potential damage to any of our body, then what we find is that the spinal cord can preempt the brain. So if there's, say, damage to my hand or potential damage to my hand, let's say from like a flame, as that sensation of touch is being sent up to the brain, the spinal cord intercepts it and sends its own signal out to the hand, to the muscles in the arm and the hand, so that we can pull that away before having too much danger dealt to us. We pull our hand away before that signal even gets to our brain, which is why sometimes we don't even feel the pain from that potential damage. The second section is on neurons and neurotransmitters. When we talk about psychology and biology, what we know is that everything that is psychological is also inherently biological. What that means is that no matter what sort of learning or behavioral or thought concept we're talking about, there's always a biological explanation for it. Now, way back in the day, it was believed that the skull of the human being could potentially correspond with various behaviors. We call this phrenology. It was started by a German physicist in the early 1800s, and what he did was he measured the bumps on the skull and the shape of the skull to try to predict how that might affect human behavior. Ultimately, we know this is wrong. However, what we do know is that different parts of the brain do control different aspects of behavior and thought. And therefore, there was an element of truth to this. Now, within our brain, we have the neurons, and neurons are the cells of the nervous system. These cells, there's three different types of these cells. Interneurons are the connecting neurons. They connect with other interneurons in the brain and the spinal cord. They also connect with sensory and motor neurons that take place outside the central nervous system, outside the brain and the spinal cord. There are close to 300 billion interneurons within our brain and spinal cord. The sensory neurons are kind of like our input signals. Whenever something occurs with one of our internal organs, or whenever we experience external stimuli, that signal needs to reach the brain. The sensory neurons are the neurons in the body that are taking that signal and transmitting it first to the spinal cord and then to the brain. The motor neurons are basically the opposite. They're the neurons that are taking those signals from the brain and sending it out to various parts of the body, specifically our muscles and our internal organs. Some sensory and motor neurons are over a foot long, such as the ones in our leg. The neuron itself is made up of a number of different parts. The nucleus and cell body's primary role is to keep the cell alive. And if you look at the diagram, you can see it with that kind of eyeball-looking shape being the nucleus and all the surrounding parts of the cell being the cell body. They're the ones that get the proteins and all sorts of nourishment from the bloodstream in order to keep the cell alive. The axon is the very long tail that you see. And the axon's primary role is to send a message to other cells in the form of neurotransmitters. Now, when a neuron sends a message, it's not like that message travels from one cell to the next to the next. The way that it works is kind of a little bit more like dominoes, where when a cell is ready to send a message, it releases its neurotransmitters, its chemical compounds, and it gets received by the next cell. That next cell, in turn, sends its neurotransmitters, which is received by even the next cell, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, this kind of chain reaction will get the signal back up to the brain. The axon is the part of the neuron that does the sending, and it does it electrically by creating an electrical charge. At the end of the axon, it splits into a number of terminal branches. These terminal branches are responsible for the actual release of the neurotransmitters, these chemical compounds that serve as messages. At the end of the axon terminal, we have these little buttons called the synaptic vesicle. And the synaptic vesicle, what it does essentially is it stores the neurotransmitters so that the cell has these neurotransmitters to release so that messages can be sent. The dendrite, those tree-ish, hairish looking things connected to the cell body, are the receiving portion of the cell. So they're the one that receives the neurotransmitters from the other cells. The myelin sheath is that covering along the axon. And the myelin sheath is a layer of fat. And what its primary responsibility is to speed up the sending of messages. The myelin sheath is fat, and fat is a good conductor of electricity. And because the way neurons send messages is electrical, the myelin sheath causes those messages to be sped up. And finally, in between the various layers of the myelin sheath, we have the nodes of Ranvier. And the nodes of Ranvier serve as for ion diffusion. And this will be important when we talk about action potential, which will be on the next slide. This is the 5 steps of action potential, but instead of spending time on the text of this, I'm going to go to a diagram on the next slide and kind of explain it. You can always go back and take a look at the various steps of this. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at a small portion of the axon. Now, action potential is how neurotransmission takes place. It's how the cell creates enough energy to send a message in the form of a neurotransmitter. It all starts when the cell experiences some higher levels of excitement, higher levels of stimulation. If the cell body is stimulated enough, and this can come directly from the cell itself, or it can come when it receives a message through its dendrites, it can start to stimulate the cell. Once it stimulates the cell and it crosses a certain threshold, action potential begins. Now, action potential only goes one way down the cell, as we saw in this slide here. We can take a look at those arrows and how the message only goes down the axon, not back up it. Once it creates a certain level of excitement, though, before that begins, the axon is in resting potential. And this is only one small portion of the axon. When this whole process occurs in this first small portion, then that sets off enough stimulation for the next portion of the axon to go through the same process. Ultimately, this keeps on occurring until we get to the terminal branches, and that increase of stimulation causes the release of neurotransmitters. But when we start off, the cell is in a negative charge. There are positive potassium ions inside the cell and positive sodium ions outside the cell. Now, the charge is negative because there's other molecules in the cell called anions, which are very negative and can't leave. And because potassium ions are not super heavily positive charged, the overall charge is negative inside the cell. Now, once that threshold is crossed, though, action potential begins. And what occurs is in those nodes of Ranvier, we have sodium-potassium pumps that you can kind of see here. And when there's enough stimulation, the sodium begins to transfer inside the cell. This changes the overall charge of the cell to positive because sodium ions are incredibly positive. And so this is called depolarization. Now, eventually, the potassium ions will also begin to leave during this time. And so this is what kind of creates stimulation. This depolarization creates the stimulation to set off this chain reaction in the next portion of the cell. So while that next portion of the cell is beginning its process of depolarization and of the charges being changed, the first part of the cell is going through what we call hyperpolarization, where now the potassium ions are leaving, and it's primarily sodium ions inside. And then ultimately, once this hyperpolarization happens, the cell goes into what we call a refractory period. This is when no charges can happen. So even if there's additional stimulation, nothing will occur during this refractory period. It's kind of like a recharge period. And during this recharge period, the potassium and sodium pumps shut down. And then ultimately, as it goes through this recharge period, this refractory period, we have something called the sodium potassium transporter, which pulls all the sodium back out and all the potassium back in, ultimately getting us back to resting potential. And we can see all the steps here. You can see that step 1, stimulus causes depolarization. If it gets excited enough, all those sodium channels open and the membrane depolarizes. At the peak of it, the potassium channels open and begins to leave the cell. And at the same time, the sodium channels close, which is repolarization, and it becomes back to being negative. It becomes hyperpolarized as sodium ions continue to leave the cell. It's in a refractory period, cannot fire. Then eventually the transporter restores the cell back to resting potential. Once it's released, once this happens over and over and over again, all the way till the end of the axon, it pushes out its neurotransmitters. These are chemical compounds that serve as messages from one cell to the next. Now, in order for this to occur, though, the neurotransmitters need to cross a microscopic gap known as the synapse, sometimes called the synaptic gap. It's about 1/10,000th of an inch wide, so it's microscopic. And when these neurotransmitters cross this gap, they're looking to bind themselves into receptor sites, which are specifically shaped areas of the dendrites of the other cells that receive these individual neurotransmitters. Each dendrite has multiple receptor sites for multiple neurotransmitters. And so whatever receptor sites are activated, that causes that will be the message that is then sent. If enough receptor sites are activated by receiving neurotransmitters, it will create a level of stimulation in the cell that starts action potential all over again in that very next cell. There are always excess neurotransmitters that cross the synapse but don't find the receptor sites. Those are reabsorbed back into the original cell in a process called reuptake. This makes it so that the neurotransmitter never is depleted of all its, it makes it so that the cell is never depleted of all its neurotransmitters. There are two different types of neurotransmitters, excitatory and inhibitory. Excitatory neurotransmitters make the stimulation go faster and make it more likely that the next cell is going to be stimulated. Inhibitory neurotransmitters slow down the reaction, and if there's enough inhibitory neurotransmitters, it will cause the cell to maybe not cross that level of stimulation where action potential may not occur. There are a number of different neurotransmitters that we need to know. We also need to understand what an undersupply and oversupply does. ACH is the most common neurotransmitter in our body. It's called acetylcholine. It's there for memory, learning, and muscle movement. Too much of it might be the cause of obsessive compulsive disorder. We know for a fact that not having enough is the cause of Alzheimer's disease, which is a neurodegenerative disease that affects our memory. And if you see the function of ACH, then you'll see that memory is a big part of it. Dopamine is our pleasure neurotransmitter, but it's not just physical pleasure. It's also that emotional pleasure. Like, for example, when we eat and food tastes really good and we say, oh my God, that's amazing. That's dopamine kicking in. Too much of it causes schizophrenia, where an undersupply will cause Parkinson's disease. Serotonin is our neurotransmitter that affects mood and hunger and sleep. Too much of it makes us manic, and too little makes us depressed. And so a manic state is part of bipolar disorder, where a person is abnormally happy and abnormally in a good mood, which can also create problems. Endorphins are those neurotransmitters that we get when we exercise. They get released primarily when we exercise to reduce the pain. This can create things like runner's high, where a person can push their body way beyond its normal limits because they're having that pain reduced. Glutamate and GABA are our major excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. Some glutamate will cause action potential to become much more likely, whereas GABA will make it much less likely that action potential occurs in the next cell. And then finally, we get to epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is designed to put the body into its sympathetic state, and it's what pushes the body from its state of calm to in a state of arousal, and it activates its fight or flight response. Norepinephrine, its kind of partner in crime, helps control the body during this time. It helps bring the body back to normal when we're ready to go back into a state of calm. So while epinephrine gets everything going, norepinephrine is the one that really maintains the body as its internal organs are getting less blood sugar, and we have more blood sugar devoted to muscles and higher heart rate and higher breath rate, etc. The last section is on the endocrine system, which is our system that is run through the hormones, that controls our hormones. Hormones are chemical compounds similar to neurotransmitters. Hormones, however, travel through the bloodstream rather than through different neurons. And they're secreted by different glands throughout the body. These are a lot of our internal organs are actually glands of the endocrine system, like, for example, the stomach or the pancreas. These glands secrete hormones into our bloodstream, which then travels our blood and affects how we act and how we feel and how we behave. The part of the brain that controls our endocrine system is a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which we'll spend much more time on later. But the hypothalamus basically gets its primary is the primary master of the endocrine system, and it works hand in hand with the master gland of the endocrine system called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, when it secretes its hormone, its part is basically right in front of your ear. It's kind of in the brain. It secretes its hormone that instructs other glands to secrete their hormones. So it's kind of like the master gland that controls them all. What we know is that with the endocrine system, everything starts and ends with the brain. When we have a thought, like let's say we have a thought that we're feeling fear, then all of a sudden the pituitary gland will receive a message from the hypothalamus about that. The pituitary gland will release its hormone, which will then travel down to the adrenal glands. These adrenal glands will then release epinephrine and norepinephrine, the only hormone that's also a neurotransmitter that will put our body in our fight or flight mode. So now our hormones are working, our body's in fight or flight mode. We feel that change in our body, and then our brain responds accordingly. So now we feel stronger, we feel faster, and now our brain says, okay, let's run away from that burning building. Aside from the pituitary gland, there are a number of other glands that we need to know. The adrenal gland, which I mentioned before, helps trigger the fight or flight response. The pancreas controls the level of sugar in our blood with a hormone called insulin. An imbalance of that can create things like diseases like diabetes. The thyroid and parathyroids can control metabolism and the calcium levels in the blood. And our sex gland is designed to release our sex hormones, which then allow for reproduction and other sexual behavior. I always get the question, what's the difference between hormones and neurotransmitters? They're both of these chemical compounds that can affect our behavior, that can affect our thoughts, that can affect our feelings. And what we know is that there's some distinct differences between the two. Neurotransmitters are released electrically. Their effect is almost instantaneous because of the quick electrical reaction. Hormones, on the other, are secreted chemically into the bloodstream. This means that when neurotransmitters are released, we feel it instantly. But with hormones, it sometimes takes a little while for us to feel the effect of the hormones. And then sometimes, too, even once we're done with that situation, because the hormone hasn't left our bloodstream, it can also cause that continued effect in the change of mood. And if you've ever gotten really mad and really upset, really emotional, and then it ended and you were still mad and upset and emotional, it's probably because that hormone hadn't completely left your bloodstream. All right, so that is the endocrine system, and I hope you guys have a good understanding about the endocrine system and action potential and neurons and the nervous system.